Do female judges vote differently? In Canada, we are going to get a new Supreme Court justice, but his appointment will mean an end to a historically anomalous period in Canada's history where there were more women than men on the Supreme Court of Canada. Up until Justice Sheila Martin resigned a few weeks ago, there were 5 women and 4 men. Step 1 will be to gather court data, and I think I know the website to do it. They should have an API section here that will let me download all of their... It looks like you are limited. And if you go to their terms of use under the prohibited uses section, it actually says that you're not allowed to download published documents. So we're not going to be able to get our data from CanLII. So this is the Access to Algorithmic Justice project, a2aj.ca. They actually have a connection that you can set up with Claude, so you don't actually have to be a programmer to use the data or access it. For the purposes of this, we're not going to look at any provincial courts. We'll just look at the Supreme Court of Canada, and that way there aren't too many decisions to wade through and analyze. We're going to use this to download all of the cases, and who knows how long that's going to take. Now that I have downloaded all of the cases onto my computer, the next step will be to extract the judges from each judgment so that I can create a database of when a judge voted on what subject and when there was disagreement. After that, though, I have to figure out the statistical method that I will use to calculate agreement rates and disagreement rates and all of that. There's just one problem. I don't know statistics, but fortunately, I do have a friend who does. Hey, Claude, can you hear me?
Hey, Eugene. Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. What's up?
I was wondering if you could help me with some statistics. I am trying to figure out... After a long chat, Claude pointed out a flaw in my analysis. It's easy to pin down a percentage to relate gender and voting, but it's hard to tell how meaningful that factor is unless you compare it to other factors. What if you find out that gender explains 10% of voting behavior, but a judge's hair color explains voting behavior by 10% as well? Because we're dealing with so few justices, spurious correlations may arise, including ones between gender and voting behavior. But what should we do instead? Claude suggested multi-dimensional scaling, or MDS. This analyzes the data and lets dimensions of disagreement pop out by themselves. The catch is that MDS doesn't tell you why there was disagreement in those dimensions. So we'll figure that out later using exemplary cases from each end of every spectrum. First though, we'll need to calculate agreement rates between judges. Okay, so we have some preliminary results. In the process of extracting all the data and making sure that it is formatted correctly, I was able to create a judge agreement score, which basically shows you how often it is that 2 judges will agree on the outcome of a case. Take a look. Quick correction here, we're looking at opinion groups, not outcomes. Imagine for a case that 5 judges join the majority opinion, 2 judges concur with the outcome but disagree on the path to get there, and 2 judges dissent on both outcome and reasoning. There would be 2 groups in terms of outcomes, but 3 groups in terms of opinions. So here's the outcomes. You can see right away that some judges tend to agree with each other quite often. So Justice Kazirer agrees the most with Justice Jamal. And then there are other judges that don't agree with any other judges very often at all. So Justice Cote seems to agree with people at, on average, like 60% of the time in terms of the outcome, except with Justice Moldover. She agrees with him 71% of the time. Justice Moldover retired in 2022. Contrast this with what the agreement rates look like in the United States on their Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, at most, he will agree with someone like Justice Kavanaugh 91% of the time, but at the very least, he would agree with Justice Thomas 63% of the time. But if a pair of judges agrees often, it may not be because they share a judicial philosophy. If two judges agree in a unanimous case, that means little compared to two judges who agree in a heavily split case. To get around this problem, we made a baseline with permutation analysis to see how often a judge pair agreed compared to random. We then used these rates to calculate the MDS dimensions of agreement. So I finished the MDS analysis and discovered that there were not one, not two, but actually three distinct dimensions over which judges will tend to cluster and disagree with each other. The first one is what we'll call the workability dimension, dimension X. The workability dimension asks whether legal tests should stay fine-grained and context-sensitive, or whether they should be made more administrable and less artificial. The high-end judges on this dimension would be Rowe, Jamal, and Moldover. The low-end judges would be Moreau, Karakatsanis, and Abella. The next dimension is the legal category dimension, also called dimension Y. And its core question is, does this thing fit inside the legal box, or should the box be read more broadly because of its purpose and social context? High-end judges would be Cote, Rowe, and Brown. Low-end judges would be Karakatsanis, Martin, and Jamal. An example of a case where this would pop up is the question of whether corporations can claim that their charter rights have been violated because they are undergoing cruel and unusual punishment. The high-end judges would say cruel and unusual punishment applies to humans. A corporation is not a human, and therefore a corporation cannot claim that they are being punished cruelly and unusually. A low-end on that dimension judge would say, well, cruel and unusual punishment can mean that the state is using excessive force. And even though a corporation is not a human, a corporation can be vulnerable to the use of excessive force or excessive punishment, say because they got fines that were way too high. And for that reason, yes, a corporation can claim that they are suffering cruel and unusual punishment. That's the way that you can read this dimension. And then the last dimension would be remedial force, aka dimension Z. And the question it asks is, once a right, a wrong, or a legal problem is found, how forcefully should the court respond? So this is for cases where people agree that yes, something that took place should not have taken place, and we need to reverse the situation or fix the situation. But the question becomes, how much medicine should be applied? How big should the remedy be? High-end judges on this dimension would be Brown, Obonsawin, and Rowe. Low-end judges on this dimension would be Abella, Cote, and Moldaver. And while the dimensions are really interesting, they don't actually answer our original question. So I reached out to Claude one last time for a methodology to use to see if judge identity correlates with judge agreement. So we have a methodology. The way it's going to work is we'll have 19 factors that people care about, and then 6 control factors that should not make a difference in terms of whether judges will agree with each other. The 6 nonsense factors, or the control factors, those are there to keep the 19 honest. If you find out that one of the honest factors explain 7% of the variance, like gender, but then you find out that the year in which a judge was appointed to the bench of the Supreme Court, whether that was odd or even, if that also predicts 6% of the variance, then you know that you can toss both of those factors aside, because there's no way that whether the appointment year was odd or even predict whether judges agree with each other or not. There's going to be no correlation between those two. It turns out that there is only one factor from those 19 factors that predicts the way that different judges will agree with each other. It isn't gender. So we can answer the original question. Gender does not predict the way that judges vote with each other. Race is not another one either. Judges are not more likely to agree with people of a similar race. Age was not a factor either. Judges are not likely to agree with people because there's a bigger age gap or because there's a smaller age gap. Appointing prime minister or appointing party were also factors that did not explain whether 2 Supreme Court judges would agree with each other. The one factor that did have predictive value was how much time 2 judges had spent doing lawyers' work, being lawyers, before joining the bench. Okay, so if you have 2 judges who both practiced law for 11 years before being appointed to the bench as judges, they were more likely to agree with each other than 2 judges, one of whom had practiced for 4 years and another who had practiced for 33 years. that was the biggest factor in predicting whether two judges were likely to agree. It explained 28 to 36% of the variance, which is pretty high, suspiciously high for a finding in the social sciences. So take it with a grain of salt. I will upload the Python scripts that I used along with the raw data to GitHub so that if you would like to run the scripts yourself and double check the results, you are more than free to do so. If you're a statistician, or if you're a lawyer, or if you're a judge and you've noticed similar patterns, please let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining this wonderful data adventure. Take care.